Alright, sorry about that. I had to do this in 2 videos because I actually hit the wrong button and stopped the other video. My apologies. But anyway, as remains of the past life, such as skeletons of animals, exist on the Earth's crust on the top, eventually it is going to be rained on, right? Because it rains everywhere at some point. And over large periods of time, those skeletons will be likely to be pushed into a body of water, usually a river or something, due to erosion and weathering of the soil. And at that point then, sometimes they'll even be taken to larger rivers and then even into the ocean, where they will be deposited at the sea floor. Now, they won't remain there. So eventually, over large periods of time, they can move back to the bedrock of the Earth over here. And that is because Earth is a dynamic place. It's not just a big ball of rock. There's actually a liquid center, and then there's some areas of the Earth that are, not quite solid, but are not really watery either, somewhere in between. And there's movement underneath the Earth's crust. And that movement allows for uplift of the sedimentation to be brought back to the top. And this is as a result of movement, as well as a movement within the mantle of the Earth, as well as tectonic plates. So tectonic plates. So anyway, those patterns within the Earth's mantle will allow for movement back up towards the surface where fossils are typically discovered. Okay, so let's observe some of the fossils that Darwin viewed compared to those of modern day animals. The first fossil that he observed was of what we call now the Glyptodon. And the Glyptodon, if you look at the picture here, looks really similar to armadillos. The second one was the Mylodon. This is a group of extinct giant ground sloths. So you can see that here. And we can compare that to the modern day sloth seen on the right. So these organisms look really similar, but different. So Darwin's conclusion was also based on biogeography. And the study of biogeography is the study of the distribution of life forms. So essentially what he did here in this field of biogeography was compare the animals of South America to the ones in England. So one example that he observed was similarities across species in birds that are seen pictured here. So this is the ostrich. Ostriches live in Africa. While he was in South America, he saw a bird that looked very similar to an ostrich. They're called rays, R-H-E-A. They look really similar. However, they do have some differences, and they're on completely separate continents. Yeah. Secondly, he observed the Patagonian desert hare, which is seen here. And he stated that they look really, really similar to the European rabbit, seen here. Again, similar but different, and they are so similar, but yet on totally separate continents. So, Darwin's thoughts. Did that Patagonian hare resemble the rabbit because the two types of animals were adapted to the same environment? Or was it because they share a common ancestor? He wasn't really sure. We now know the Patagonian hare is actually more related to rodents than rabbits. This is an example of convergent evolution, where organisms will have similar characteristics just because they've adapted to the same kind of environment and not due to evolutionary history. So another great example of that would be dolphins. So dolphins, they have fins and they live in an aquatic environment, but they're mammals. They're not fish. They have fins like fish do, so they share characteristics of fish, but it's not because they are closely related to fish. They are mammals. They're in that family. They're not fish. Convergent evolution. converge means to come together. So they have characteristics they share that come together, but not due to evolutionary history, but rather just similar environments. Another example was the greater and lesser rays of South America. The greater ray is seen in northern parts of South America, whereas the lesser ray is seen in southern parts of South America. Now, these are not the only two types of rays. These are the two that he specifically observed. And you can see those pictured here. This is the northern ray. This is the southern lesser ray. And this is another type. I'm not sure what species this one particularly is. But you can compare these two and you can tell they look really similar, but yet different. So at this point, then Darwin reasoned that species can be modified according to environmental differences based on latitude. And latitude are the invisible lines that run horizontally across the earth. Yeah. So we have, the equator in the center-ish around here, but these would be the different lines of latitude going left and right. So what he's saying is that species look different in northern South America versus southern South America, which would be in a different line of latitude. And because they are located in different places, they have different environments. Another journey that he had was to the Galapagos Islands. These are a collection of islands that are off the coast of South America. And they're, I think about, if I remember correctly, it's either 600 miles or 600 kilometers. Either way, that's a pretty good distance, and it's too far from the mainland for most terrestrial animals and terrestrial plants to colonize. So what that means is that these organisms are isolated that live on these islands. They are isolated from the mainland species. So what he found was that species there were slightly different on the Galapagos Island than from the mainland forms. More so, species also varied between the islands. So again, the Galapagos Islands is a collection of islands. It's too far from the coast for these animals to intermingle, and there's also variation and no intermingling between the islands. So where did these species come from, and why are they different? How did they get there? The first set of organisms he observed were finches. Finches are birds. Some finches were like the mainland finches on these islands, but others were quite different. There were ground-dwelling finches. These are birds that live on the ground. They live on the ground because that's where their food source is. They eat seeds and nuts that have fallen to the ground from seed-bearing plants. So their beak size were very large because they need that large beak size to be able to crack open nuts and seeds to eat them. Very strong. However, we also had tree-dwelling finches that had different beak sizes and shapes that are dependent to whatever their insect prey is. Typically, the tree-dwelling finches, beak size will be smaller, oftentimes a little bit more pointed. So he said that these finches could have been descended from a mainland finch, and he formulated then the term speciation, the formation of a new species. He said that this process occurred because the isolated populations evolved independently of the mainland population. So if they're isolated, that means they're not interbreeding. And so only the organisms that are suited for the environment in island number 1 are going to live, and they're going to pass on the genes and traits for those survivable characteristics. Same thing would happen on island 2, island 3, etc., as well as the mainland. So here's some examples, some pictures of these finches. Here we have the ground-dwelling finch, which again, they're adapted to eating seeds and nuts. You can see how large the beak is. It looks very powerful compared to these two. This is our woodpecker finch. And what they typically do is they, of course, peck the tree bark, and that will allow them access into the tree bark where they may find larvae of some kind of insects that they consume. So this would be our tree-dwelling finch. And then here's another example, a cactus finch. You can see that they have a narrow beak similar to the woodpecker finch, and they both prey on insects. Some are adapted to consuming nectar, for example. Like I believe the cactus finch also does that, where they will utilize that long pointed beak to access the nectar of plants. Another example that he viewed were the Galapagos Island tortoises. So tortoises are kind of like turtles, they look similar. But each island had its own type of tortoise. So we can view here, we have this island and this island and this island. So on this island, the tortoises have regular or have had very short necks. On this island, Pinta, we have medium-sized necks, and then down here in Hood Island, we have tortoises that have very long necks. So in these areas where these long-necked tortoises were, they were in dry areas where food was very scarce, whereas the short-necked tortoises lived in very moist, wet regions where food was abundant. These tortoises, they're adapted to eating things that are like vegetation. So essentially these different species speciated because they were, the population adapted to the environment given the food source, similar to our giraffe neck example. All right, so natural selection is what Darwin came up with that served as a mechanism for evolution, how it happens. It's a process that results in the evolution of organisms that are well adapted to their environment. And he said that natural selection requires a few things. The first thing is that members of a population have to have heritable variation. That means there has to be variation in the population, meaning organisms of the same species are different. Just like if you look at the species of humans, we all look different. No two of us look identical. Well, unless you have an identical twin, of course. And these variations of our characteristics have to be heritable, meaning that they are controlled by genes that are passed down from offspring or from parent to offspring. The second requirement is that there is more offspring produced than can be supported, which means some organisms are going to die in every generation due to not being adapted to their environment. 3, individuals with favorable traits survive and reproduce more than those lacking said traits. And number 4, across generations, a larger proportion of the population possesses the favorable traits and become adapted to that environment. All right, so natural selection uses only variations resulting from genetic changes. So that's something we mentioned on the previous slide, but it's a point that really needs to be driven home. Remember, we can only inherit things that are controlled by genetics. Now, these variable changes in our genes are the result of just random mutations. Our differences in DNA from me compared to you is a result of random mutations in our evolutionary history. So, for example, I don't have any wisdom teeth. I never got any. And historically, most humans do have wisdom teeth. And if you look at our evolutionary history, many generations ago, everyone had wisdom teeth. But at some point along the line, an individual had a random mutation, and these random mutations are typically caused by DNA polymerase, if you recall DNA polymerase. That's our enzyme that adds in free nucleotides when copying DNA. Typically, these random mutations occur when DNA polymerase makes a mistake. DNA polymerase is almost perfect, but he's not perfect. And he does make mistakes, and these mistakes result in random mutations that can affect the physiology of the organism. So somewhere in our evolutionary history, there is a random mutation that caused the formation of wisdom teeth to not occur. Well, that was beneficial to our population because in conjunction with that, over the past thousands of years, our skulls in our evolutionary history have gotten smaller over time. If you look at the succession of our common ancestors to today's modern day human skull, the skulls have gotten smaller. Well, with all of those wisdom teeth, that created a problem. Our skull was now getting smaller, but our teeth then didn't have enough room to erupt, and that would lead to impaction in the mouth and sometimes infection. And of course, if the mouth is infected, that can lead to death, especially many years back where we did not have antibiotics or any medical surgeries that could be done to correct it. So back then, if you had wisdom teeth, you were more likely to die because you would more likely get impacted teeth, and then that would result in infection. And if you die from it, well, then you don't pass on those genes to the next generation. So, however, again, somewhere along our evolutionary history, there is a random mutation that resulted in a lack of wisdom teeth. And that person, the very first individual that had that mutation, passed that gene on to their offspring, who then also, maybe they had 4 children. Maybe 2 of those children wound up having that same mutation. And so now we have 2 children that, when they grow up, can pass that gene to their offspring. So currently, there's about 20% of the population that does not have all of their wisdom teeth. And I'm one of the lucky ones that don't have any wisdom teeth and never did. They don't exist in my mouth. And what I mean by that is, sometimes you can have teeth that are below the gum line that just never erupt, but mine are not there at all. So it's really great. Never had to worry about having them removed. Okay, now an important thing to know is there is no direction or anticipation for future needs. This mutation did not occur because the jaw was getting smaller. It was a random mutation that made the wisdom teeth not develop, and therefore that organism was more adapted to the smaller jaw size. Our cells and the molecules they don't have brains saying, oh, our brains our skulls are getting smaller over time. Let's get rid of this gene for wisdom teeth. That's not how it works. It's just random chance. And that random chance benefited the population because they weren't getting infected teeth, and therefore they made more babies, and those babies made more babies that had that same trait. So again, now we have about 20% of the population that don't have all their wisdom teeth. Okay, this is an ongoing process. As the environment changes, the suitability of adaptations can change. Okay, so prior to Darwin, these variations were considered imperfections and ignored. But these variations are essential to Darwin's natural selection process. And genes, together with the environment, determine phenotype. These mutations, chromosomal rearrangements, which is a type of mutation, and the assortment of chromosomes during meiosis, recall meiosis, and fertilization can cause new variations to arise. And whether or not that change in the genetic material is beneficial or not will be determined by the environment. If that mutation is beneficial, then we would say that it increases the fitness for that organism. By definition, fitness means the reproductive success of an individual relative to other members of the population. So if an organism is more fit for their environment, it strictly just means that they are better able to make babies, live and make babies. They are better able to live and make babies compared to the rest of the members of the population. So it has nothing to do with being the biggest, the baddest, the strongest. It is how well an organism is suited to live and reproduce. An organism's relative fitness is determined by comparing the number of surviving fertile offspring that are produced by each member of the population. All right, so again, determined by comparing the number of surviving fertile offspring produced by each member of a population. So if we have, let's say, horse 1 and they make 2 babies. We'll call them A and B. And A, that horse baby is not fertile, meaning it can't reproduce. And we compared it to horse number 2. Horse 1, horse 2. And she also had 2 babies. Call them A and B again. Both of which are fertile and procreate themselves. Then horse number 2 would be more fit because she produced more fertile surviving offspring. That one couldn't reproduce and this one did. All right, so the most fit individuals will be able to capture the most resources and convert it to a larger number of viable offspring. So let's say, in this example, maybe there's something genetically or something wrong with horse A, and it just could not produce offspring because there's something wrong with its reproductive tract. That would be one example of a reason why it would not be fertile. Maybe this horse was in an area where there was not a lot of food. And so instead of worrying about making babies, she's worried about surviving. So that would also be an example of a reason for non-fertility. So the most fit individuals capture most resources, aka food, and convert it to viable offspring. All right, and so again, what determines fitness doesn't mean biggest, strongest, baddest superpowers, okay? And that's a common misconception. Whenever you think most fit, some students I've noticed in the past will think the biggest one must be the most fit. The strongest one must be the most quote-unquote fit. But that's not true. Fitness is determined by the environment and is different for various populations. So, here's an example. Here we have a population of mice. These mice have moved into a new area and their environment is really dark, very dark rocks. So this bird overhead preys on these mice. It's its food source. So if you notice, these mice are of different colors. We have the black variety and we have the brown variety, and fur color is determined by genetics. And so it is a heritable trait. Which one of these mice do you think are going to be more readily visible to this bird? The brown ones. So they're going to eat all these brown mice because they're able to see them very well because they're not camouflaged very well. That's going to result in the population changing to have less brown mice relative to black mice. So here we had 3 black mice and 6 brown mice. Now we see a reduction in the population of brown mice to only 2 and then still 3 black mice. So if these mice reproduce, they make babies together, the population in the next generation is likely to change where we have more black mice than we do brown mice, like as opposed to the very first generation, because there's more black mice. So because there's more black mice in the population relative to the brown ones, then we're most likely going to see a larger proportion of black mice in the next generation compared to brown. So in this scenario, black fur color was the fittest characteristic. It has nothing to do with strength or biggest. It's fur color. Now, let's take this example and switch it. Let's say that these mice then moved into a sandy desert, and the desert sand is brown. Well, then the brown fur would be the most favorable characteristic, and we would see a lot of the black mice being eaten by the birds, and that would result in a disproportionate ratio of brown mice to black mice, where the brown mice would be more common, and thus in the next generation we would see more brown mice than black mice. All right, so after Darwin returned to England, he returned in 1836. He waited 20 years to publish his findings. He called his findings The Origin of Species. That was the book that he wrote. He continued over these 20 years gathering evidence to support his hypotheses, but he kept it to himself. He knew that if he posted this or if he wrote this book and published it, it would be, you know, it would be just a shell shock to the world, and he would get a lot of backlash from people that didn't believe him. However, Alfred Russel Wallace, had some similar thinkings, and he was prompted to publish after reading a similar hypothesis by him. Wallace was also a naturalist from England. He was also a collector of fossils at home and abroad, just like Darwin. And he conceived the idea of, or coined the phrase, if you will, quote unquote, the survival of the fittest. And he sent his essay to Darwin for commentary, and so together they presented a joint paper to the Linnean Society, which was a scientific community at that time, and eventually announced to the world that the species evolved through natural selection with common descent. All right, so let's discuss some of the evidence that we now have for evolutionary change. So the theory of evolution states that all living things have a common ancestor, but each is adapted to a particular way of life. So you and me, we have a common ancestor. You and a banana and me have a common ancestor. You, me, the banana, and a bacteria share a common ancestor. That common ancestor could have been millions, maybe millions of years, could have existed millions of years ago. But we do have a common ancestor. So the hypotheses became a scientific theory only when a variety of evidence from independent investigators supported the hypotheses. So that's something that I would like to elaborate on. So we've talked about hypotheses and theories way on back in like chapter, I think it was 1. Remember, when we say like a theory just in layman's terms, it doesn't seem that serious, but a theory in the scientific community is very serious. There is not much, there's so much evidence for what we would consider a theory that there's really not much, very many people that disagree, because there's just so much overwhelming evidence for it. The theory of evolution is a unifying theme in biology because it can explain all these different observations in various fields of biology, even molecular biology, these naturalist biologists, ecology, geology, all of these different fields are seeing similar things and provide evidence that support evolutionary theory. So some of the evidence that we have includes fossil evidence, as we've spoke about previously. So fossils are trapped in the stratum, or they're in the rocks, they're in the Earth's crust, or even lower. And we've collected lots and lots of fossils as a scientific community over the course of the past 100, 200 years. And we call that collection of fossils the fossil record. And that has helped tell us a little bit about the history of life. We have found succession of life forms from simple to more complex. We have found fossils that represent transitional links between groups. A great example is and forgive me if I mispronounce this, Archaeopteryx. But this fossil is an intermediate between reptiles and birds. Also, evolution of whales are well-established. We have a well-established fossil record of that. So let's look at some pictures of those things. So this is our Archaeopteryx. This is the fossil, and this is the illustration of how we believe it probably looked. So you can see the head, the wings, the feet, and the tail. And this fossil serves as a transitional fossil between reptiles and birds. You can see it has reptilian features in red, like the tail with the vertebrae. Kind of looks like an alligator tail, right? It has claws and scaly feet and hands like reptiles do, and teeth as well. But it also has feathers and wing-like structures like birds do. So this is the transitional link between birds and reptiles. Next, the evolution of tetrapods. Tetrapods are organisms that have 4 feet. The fossil was found in 2004. We call it the fishapod because it is a transition between fish and tetrapods. It is named, and again, forgive me if I mispronounce, Tiktaalik rosii. It is a transitional link between fish and our tetrapods or four-legged animals. But it has a mix of fish and tetrapod-like characteristics. So, for example, here's the fish. Excuse me, and this is our early amphibian, and this is somewhere in the middle, our Tiktaalik rosii, our fishapod, if you will. This scale, by the way, shows you millions of years ago. So this would have been 380 million years ago, whereas over here our early amphibians are 360 million years ago. Around 370 million years ago is when we had our fishapod. But they have fins similar to a fish, as well as gills, which allowed it to swim as well as breathe underwater. The fins, however, have the beginning of wrist bones. All right, so you can definitely see those wrist bones here in our early amphibian, but they are also seen in our fossil record of our fishapod. The eyes are located on top of the head. The head is flat, so think it like an alligator, sort of. So whereas our fish eyes are located on the sides of the head and they have a rounder head. So again, a mix of our early amphibian characteristics with our fish characteristics, allowing it to live in a really shallow water, but also come onto land somewhat. This graphic shows you the evolution of whales. So our fossil record indicates that our whales evolved from land-dwelling animals that have hooves. So this would have been a scale that shows you the present day up at the top, and this is 60 million years ago. This is our hypothetical skeleton for our primitive ancestors to modern-day whales. Moving forward around 45-ish million years ago, you can see that this animal probably walked on land too based on its bone structures, but it probably swam as well, looking again at the hind bone structures. It most likely swam by flexing its backbone and paddling with its hind limbs, and modern-day otters do that. So moving forward, 30 million years ago, we can see the reduced hind limbs. The hind limbs are very large here, and they are reduced here. They could not have aided it in walking at this point. Looking at the bone structure, it just is not conducive to walking. And so because of that, it is most likely a swimmer at this point. They most likely also move their bodies, and especially the lower half of their bodies, up and down as modern day whales do to help propel it forward. And here we have the bone anatomy of modern day whales. So they still do have, in many species, some remnants of hip bones, but they're very, very small. Next, we have biogeographical evidence. That is, again, the study of distributions of organisms throughout the world. The distribution is consistent with the hypothesis that when forms are related, they evolved in one locale or location and then spread to all accessible regions. So, for example, in South America, they lack rabbits, even though the environment is suitable, but that's because they are separated from the rabbit species. So remember, South America, we said it looks like a rabbit, but it's actually more related to rodents, the Patagonian hare. It looks like modern England rabbits, but it's not a rabbit. It's a rodent, and that's result. The rabbit does not dwell in South America because it is separated by continents and ocean bodies. So they can't physically get there. The rabbits only spread where they have access to. All right, some additional evidence of that is related to biogeography is that South America, Antarctica, and Australia, along with the other continents, were connected a very, very long time ago. Think 225 million years ago. If we drew a map of the Earth, this is what it would look like. We call this Pangea. It's a supercontinent, just a single continent in the center of the Earth. And over time, due to movement of tectonic plates, the Earth's crust shifted and formed the separate land masses. So looking at the Triassic era here, we see there is some separation going on. Moving forward to 135 million years ago in the Jurassic period, we see more separation and more separation in the Cretaceous period. And then this is what our present day map looks like. And our continents are still moving today. Like for example, Hawaii is moving further and further away from the continental USA over time. Now it's a very slow movement, but it does happen. All right, so how does it relate to biogeographical evidence for evolution? Marsupials. Marsupials are organisms that carry offspring that are not developed in a pouch while they mature. For example, kangaroos. And they are in contrast to placental mammals. Placental mammals are organisms that allow for their offspring to develop in a placenta, like humans. When a female gets pregnant, the placenta forms and it is inside the uterus of the female, and it gives nutrients to the baby internally inside the mom. So it's different. So marsupials are only very plentiful in Australia. And that's because Australia contained marsupial species as it drifted away from the remainder of Pangea. So that separated those marsupials from competition with placental mammals. In the rest of the world, if there was marsupials in areas outside of past Australia, they were outcompeted by placental mammals because it's just the offspring are more likely to survive within the mother in the placenta or being fed through the placenta rather than maturing outside of the placenta. So again, marsupials had less competition in Australia. They were free to evolve into many different forms, and that's why Australia has our most prevalent examples of marsupials. In America, the only marsupial that exists are possums. Now, in some cases, marsupials and placental mammals resemble each other, which is interesting. This supports the hypothesis that evolution is influenced by the environment. But the wombat versus the marmot, they look really similar. One's a marsupial, one's a placental mammal. The Tasmanian wolf, marsupial, versus the standard wolf, the American wolf, which is a placental mammal. I actually think the Tasmanian wolf is now extinct, by the way. Sugar gliders versus flying squirrels. Sugar gliders are marsupials. Flying squirrels are mammals, or placental mammals, excuse me. All right, here's a few pictures. Yep, that was right. The Tasmanian wolf is now extinct, but it was a carnivore that resembled the American wolf. Here's our sugar glider and the wombat. All of these are marsupials. Now, we also have anatomical evidence for evolution, and anatomical means having to deal with the anatomy, the structure of an organism. The first piece of anatomical evidence that we have is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are features that are fully developed in one group, but reduced or non-functional in similar groups. So, for example, whales, we mentioned those already, they have vestigial pelvic bones, hip bones. They're not used. They don't need them, but they excuse me, still have them because their ancestors did. Most birds have wings because most birds are suited to fly, but ostriches have wings and they don't. They're still birds, but they don't fly. They still have wings, but they can't fly. Snakes. also have remnants of hip bones and legs. Humans have a tailbone. And a couple other examples are listed down here. We already talked about wisdom teeth, but goosebumps. So if you ever get scared, you know, your hair will start standing up on the back of your neck. You might get those goosebumps. Well, think about why. These little goosebumps that you get are actually your hair standing on end due to a tiny muscle in your skin that surrounds each pore where a hair would come out. They're called erector pili muscles. And whenever you have these fight or flight feelings, it causes the muscles to be stimulated, and that makes the hairs stand up. Well, in our past history of humans, we were much more hairy in the past. And so that hair standing up allowed for those, it made us look bigger, essentially. Think about an animal that's really hairy. For example, a cat. That's a great example. So, when a cat gets scared, all their hair stands up on end, and they, do that little jumping motion, and essentially that makes that animal look bigger. So it makes it look bigger, and therefore whatever is scaring it, let's say it's a dog, may be less likely to attack because, oh, that animal is bigger than I thought it was. So in our past history, long, long ago, one of our common ancestors had a trait such as that as well. And we still have them today. The appendix is another example. The appendix is a little worm-like structure that hangs off of the large intestines at the very end here. Or this would be the beginning, actually. But it has no purpose. We believe that it might have been utilized in our past history because we had a different diet than we do today. For example, back before modern times, long before humans ate raw meat, they didn't have fire. At some point, that was something that was created by, or not created by humans, but ways were developed over time to help induce fire so we could cook. But before that, we were accustomed to eating raw meats, and it's possible that pouch there, that appendix, may have had something to do with being able to digest those types of foods. The next piece of anatomical evidence is homologous structures. Remember, homo is a prefix that means same. So homologous structures are anatomically similar. They're anatomically same, or they're similar. And this is explained by inheritance from a common ancestor. So if we look at vertebrate forelimbs, that's one example that will demonstrate homologous structures. They have similar organizations of the bones despite having dissimilar functions due to being adapted to different environments. So for example, in purple, we have the whale, cat, bird, bat, horse, and human. In human, that bone is called the humerus. And I don't think there's an O there, even though there would be if something was funny. But I'm pretty sure in the spelling of humerus and the bone, there's not. Anyway, that's irrelevant. But it's called the humerus in humans. So this would be the horse's humerus, and the bird, and the bat, and the cat, and the whale. They all have that same bone. Next, in the blue and yellow, we have the human form. This is called the radius and the ulna. Well, the horse has a radius and ulna as well. It's structured similarly, but different due to the function of their legs and how they walk. Bats, birds, cat, whale, they all have a radius and ulna, or a homologous structure to the radius and ulna that humans have. Next, the wrist bones are in green. You can see those in each organism. Down here in the cat, and the whale, and then the finger bones. So they have the same organization of bones, but the bones are slightly differently shaped because they are adapted to different environments and thus needed those bones to function differently. So homology is shared by vertebrates. It extends to their embryological development. So at some point during development, all vertebrates have two things: a postnatal or postanal tail and pharyngeal pouches. In fishes and amphibian larvae, pouches develop into gills. In humans, the first pair of pouches becomes the cavity of the middle ear and the auditory tube, which allows us to hear. The second pair becomes the tonsils, and the third and fourth become the thymus, which is a gland, as well as the parathyroid glands. So these new structures originated by modifying pre-existing structures from an ancestor. So if you look at the embryological development here, we have a chick and a pig. They both have this post-anal tail. If you were to look at a human, a fish, you would see these things. A pig, many animals have this. And you can see they both have eyes that are located here. This would be the beginnings of the brain and the spinal cord. But you can also see the pharyngeal pouches. You can see them better in this image. So kind of, you see how it's lighter there. That would be one pouch, two pouches. And usually if there's multiple pouches. But it's just due to the staining and the way the specimen is laying, it can be hard to see them. But this one has them too. So you can see one here, maybe two. All right, so that's homology in embryology. Next, analogous structures. This is in contrast to homology. So analogous structures are structures that look similar, but it's not, or excuse me, that they may look similar. They're not constructed similarly. They're different, but they serve the same function. So here we have a bird wing and an insect wing. They look somewhat the same in overall shape. They look like wings, but they don't have the same anatomy. So here in the bat, we see all of these bone structures. Well, this wing is not homologous to that wing because it does not have any of those bone structures. There is no similarity in the anatomy there. They just both have wings. So they have wings because they are adapted to the same lifestyle for flight, but it's not the result of a common ancestor. These organisms do have a common ancestor, but the wing characteristic, the fact that they have wings, is not a result of the common ancestor. It's due to them adapting to their environment. All right, and lastly, we have molecular evidence. Molecular evidence includes the fact that all living organisms utilize the same DNA. They all utilize ATP as a means of energy. We have nearly identical enzymes that are found amongst all species. We use the same genetic code. And if you recall, the genetic code is that table that shows for every codon of RNA what amino acid will be added to a growing polypeptide chain to build proteins. So we all utilize the same code, the same DNA base pairs. We all use guanine, cytosine, adenine, thymine, uracil. All use ATP. Next, many of what we call developmental genes, which are called Hox genes, HOX, they're shared in all animals, even those ranging from little tiny worms all the way to humans. We have these Hox genes that we share. So life's vast diversity has come about from slight differences in some of these genes. So for example, a gene that is similar in arthropods and vertebrates has a slightly different genetic sequence. And that particular gene determines front to back axis. And what that means is the location of the spinal cord relative to the front and back of the body. So for example, this would be a vertebrate. An animal who is a vertebrate has a backbone, like this dog, and the spinal cord is located towards the back. Whereas over here we have an arthropod, and the arthropod does not have a backbone. It is not a vertebrate. It is an arthropod. Arthropods are, organisms like insects. They have 6 legs. Their legs are usually hinged at multiple locations. Think bees, mosquitoes. Those are arthropods. So anyway, their body plan has the brain here with the spinal cord running along the front towards the stomach of the organism. So again, that's controlled by a small change in the same gene. All right, and lastly, this is another example showing you another piece of molecular evidence that we have for evolution. This is demonstrating the number of amino acid differences of various organisms compared to humans of the cytochrome C gene. Cytochrome C is a molecule utilized in the electron transport chain that helps generate ATP for organisms. Recall that from our chapter on cellular respiration. And this data shows the number of amino acid differences on this axis here. And then on the x-axis, various animals. So if we compare humans to monkeys, if we compare their cytochrome C gene to ours, or their cytochrome C protein, we will see that there is relatively only very few, maybe like 2 or 3 amino acid differences. However, if we were to compare humans to fish, we're seeing, around 20-ish amino acid differences. If we look at the cytochrome C protein sequence for humans and compare it to yeast, which are a mold, we can see we're looking at upwards of 50 amino acid differences between yeast and human. So what that tells us then, it gives evidence that humans are most similar to monkeys, and we are most different to yeast. And then all of these other organisms fit in between. So, an example I could ask you on a test, if I gave you this picture, I could say, based on the amino acid differences of the cytochrome C protein, which organism is most similar to humans? And I could say fish, turtle, duck, or pig. And you would tell me pig, because it has the least number of differences relative to the other organisms. All right, everyone, that is chapter 14. I hope you enjoyed it.